Well, aloha everyone, and welcome back to Anatomy 1 here at Chaminade University. Today we will be going over Unit 13, which will cover spinal nerves and reflexes. We have three major purposes of this chapter. The first is to both identify and describe different anatomical features of the spinal cord and of the spinal nerves. So we'll go over all of the different features of the spinal cord and the spinal nerves first, and then from there we'll talk about the functions of the spinal cord and the spinal nerves, and talk about how they are involved in regulating homeostatic conditions within the body. And then last but not least, we'll talk about spinal reflex arcs. What happens when you step on a tack or something hot? How do you tell your body to move your leg when you receive an impulse from, say, your toe? All right, so what is the purpose of the spinal cord? So the main purpose of the spinal cord is to process reflexes, what I just talked about, the getting some sort of sensory information in and then causing a reactive change that causes some sort of motor function response. And we will talk about how we process all of this information, both the incoming and the outcoming information. So this is excitatory and this is inhibitory. So excitatory would be something that increases or causes something to happen, and inhibitory would be something that decreases or stops something from happening. And then we'll talk about, it also has a responsibility to take information or sensory impulses into the brain from, for example, something that you touch is a sensory impulse, or something that you hear, sensory impulse. And then that's going to turn into a motor impulse or some sort of motion from your skeletal muscle to the effectors, which again could be something like your foot moving off of that tack that you just stepped on. But we can also have other effectors like our internal organs. So, for example, if we get a fight or flight reflex of some sort because we get startled with a loud noise, that can decrease our digestive pathways, for example, because we are going to be increasing the pathway that's going to cause us to induce fight or flight. But I digress. So let's talk about what keeps the spinal cord protected. We have several different layers of protection. First, we have the spinal column, so the bones, the vertebrae that we talked about when we talked about all of the different structures of the different vertebrae. It's actually set up not only to articulate with the vertebrae around it, but to have a protective region in the middle, that foramen that runs through, that is able to allow the spinal cord to run through, but it also serves a great surface area protection. We also have connective tissue underneath that. Those are known as the meninges. And anyone you know that's ever had meningitis, that's just an inflammation of the meninges. And I say just, but it's actually a very intense condition. It can be caused by a bacteria, so it could be bacterial meningitis, or it can be viral meningitis. So then, surrounding or inside that connective tissue, we have cerebrospinal fluid, so that's going to be CSF. You may have heard that before, and that's actually going to be inside here in this region, and it's going to be filling all of the cavity that surrounds the actual spinal cord. So let's talk about some of the anatomy here. So starting from the spinal cord and working our way outward. Here's our spinal cord, and then right around that we're going to have an epidural space. So anyone who's ever had an epidural, ladies during childbirth, for example, what they're going to do is they're going to tap into your spinal column and inject something into that cerebrospinal fluid that's going to cause a nerve and cause your nerves to not fire or to not relay information into the brain. All right, so again, the spinal cord is this whole region. Then inside that spinal column, we have this epidural space. The actual spinal column itself is comprised of matter, pia matter. We have both dark matter, so we have what we call gray matter, and then also white matter. And as we move forward in that, you'll see that actually looks like a butterfly in some way, and has different horns that you'll be able to see pretty distinctly. Let's see, we also have this other space here. So we have the subarachnoid space, which goes underneath the arachnoid layer, and then we have the epidural space, which goes underneath the dural layer. We have a lot of ligaments that hold it together. So for example, this here is the denticulate ligament. I don't see other ligaments, but we'll see other ligaments as we move forward. Let's see, just to orient you, this is obviously the posterior region and the anterior region. I suppose I should have done that first, but this is what's going to be headed towards your back and towards your belly. And we have several different root ganglions that come out of the spinal cord. So this is the posterior root of the spinal cord, and then we also have the anterior root of the spinal cord, which is going to be the root that comes out from the side towards your belly, right, as opposed to the side towards your back. And then we have several foramen, right? And so this would be the transverse foramen here. And then here they're going to have arteries. There's the vertebral artery here, and that's going to allow for, obviously, for blood supply. So we're going to have several sets of holes inside the vertebrae themselves that are going to allow for passage of, for example, the entire spinal cord, or for another example would be things like arteries, etc., that are also going to have to run alongside in the spinal column. So several layers of protection, including, again, the bone, the connective tissue, and the fluid layer, CSF. All right, so the meninges, as I just mentioned, that's what can get infected if you get meningitis. The meninges have three separate layers. The outermost layer is the dura mater. The innermost layer is the pia mater, and then the middle layer is the arachnoid mater. Now I'm going to go back just one slide before we continue, just to point out that lines up directly with the, so here's the dura mater, and then here's this epidural space, right? Then we also have the arachna, and here's the subarachnoid space. So there's going to be space directly underneath each of these layers that allow them to kind of glide along one another. Let's see. So the outer layer, again, that's the dura mater. Underneath that, we have that subdural space I was just talking about. Then we have here, this is the arachnoid mater. Underneath that, again, that subarachnoid space. Underneath that, we have the pia mater, or the most innermost layer, and that actually is going to be covering the entire set of the actual cord itself, the spinal cord. This is the butterfly that I was talking about previously. So we have the gray matter, which is going to be the butterfly inside, and then the white matter is everything that surrounds the butterfly on the outer space. And these are going to be responsible for two different sets of information. So one set of information is going up into the brain, and one set of information is coming back out as kind of an effector set of information. Now, if you were to picture that these nerves are kind of like roadways, then you might picture that many roads can sometimes converge into one section, into kind of like a superhighway. And that's what these here are. These are a convergence of many different sets of nerves that are coming together out into these regions here. And we'll talk about those in just a minute, but I just wanted to kind of describe what's happening. So basically a bundle of series of nerves is coming out and combining into one, what we call a spinal nerve or a highway, that are coming out from each of you. The vertebrae are missing here, but they're coming out through little spaces inside the vertebrae. Okay? All right. Now this is when students start getting nervous. So I don't want you to be nervous. I'm not going to quiz you on the specifics of this, but I want you to understand that if this is kind of like a road map, you don't have to memorize the road map, but you have to know how to navigate it. You have to know how to read it, okay? So let's talk about the spinal cord. It starts at the base of the brain here at the medulla oblongata, and it's going to travel through what's called the foramen magnum, or that very large hole at the base of your skull, and it's going to travel through the cervical region, the thoracic region, the lumbar region, the sacral region, and it's eventually going to terminate here at the L2. It doesn't actually make it into the lumbar region. So the spinal cord itself actually disappears right here around L2, and then we end up with the spinal nerve still continuing through the lumbar region, the sacrum region, and the coccyx as well. Now, let's look at them as though we're a road map. So it's split up into different regions, right? Roads that service the cervical plexus, or C1 through 5, are going to be coming out through those C vertebrae, cervical vertebrae, right? And the roads that are going to service, for example, the thoracic region are going to come out through the thoracic vertebrae. And so you'll see that they're going to be separated into what we call a plexus. So a plexus is basically when we have a lot of nerves that are going to have a lot of crosstalk that's happening. Picture something like a neighborhood where you can get from one house to the other in many different ways, depending on which way you start off and how you intend to get there. So you can actually take routes that might not be the same route and get to the same place. And that is going to be a little bit of crosstalk. And that's kind of how a plexus is. We'll talk about that in a little bit when we look at each of these plexus individually. But as you'll notice, that although the roots come out, this one comes out here from C6, it also has crosstalk up with C5 and down with C7 and C8. So each of these plexus actually interact with one another. So the cervical plexus encompasses C1 through 5. And it's going to have the occipital nerve, the great auricular nerve, the ansa cervicalis, transverse cervical nerve, supraclavicular nerve, and the phrenic nerve. And these are all going to service. Some of them are going to service most into the abdomen, but some of them are also going to supraclavicular, going to service this upper region of the neck, right? And then as we move down, we're going to enter into the brachial plexus, which serves C5 through T1. So it's the second region of the cervical vertebrae that has its own plexus. And this is going to service basically the upper arm. And actually further down, so it's going to service the upper limb. Here we have the auxiliary nerve, we have the muscular cutaneous nerve, the auxiliary nerve, the median nerve, the radial nerve, and the ulnar nerve. And you'll start to recognize as we pass through here that these are actually generally going to be named by the regions that they service. So not necessarily where they come from, but the service is the radius and the service is the ulna. So you can basically assume that this is going to be on the side that's got like the thumb, for example, and the ulna side is going to be the one that runs down to the pinky. As we follow down, We also are going to get into the intercostal nerves, which service just like what they sound, right, inside the rib cage. And then continuing to get down further, we're going to end up at the lumbar region. As we reach the lumbar region, we lose our spinal cord itself, but with the spinal nerves still travel further down. That's where we enter into the lumbar plexus. The lumbar plexus is going to service the pelvic region. It's going to include the iliohypogastric nerve. And just like you might imagine, that services, say, here's the ilia region of the hips, and then the gastric would be your stomach, so it's going to service that whole inner region here. Also, we have the ilioinguinal nerve, which services the inguinal canals, and then the genitofemoral nerve, which is going to service the genitals. As we travel down further, we end up getting the femoral nerve and the obturator nerve, which is going to allow you to move, again, the lower part of the hips, etc. And then following further down the column, we end up with the sacral plexus, which services or comes out of the sacrum and services the lower portion of the body, including the superior gluteal nerve, inferior gluteal nerve. Those are going to service your buttocks. The sciatic nerve, many of you might have had elderly family members with something called a sciatica, which is a compression or an issue. It can be also an inflammation, but basically it causes improper firing of the sciatic nerve, so there's pain associated with that in the lower limbs. And that sciatic nerve has a couple different sides. It services the common fibular nerve and the tibial nerve as well. And then we continue down to the posterior cutaneous nerve of the thigh and the pudendal nerve. Now, again, I'm not going to quiz you specifically on any of these nerves. On the plexus, yes, sure. But on the regions that they service, yes. And given a map like this, I expect that you'll be able to tell me where a signal is traveling to and from, right? Given XYZ input. All right. Now, if we're looking at the spinal cord itself, this figure seems overwhelming, but really a lot of it is very, very easily reduced to simple words. So we have the white matter and the gray matter, right? The gray matter has several sets of horns. Now, just to orient you, this is the posterior region, okay? Again, this is towards your back, this is towards your belly. So the bottom part of the butterfly actually services the front part of your body, and the top part of the butterfly services your back. Now, it's the posterior region, and if we're looking at the gray matter has horns. So the posterior horn is going to be called the posterior gray horn. This is the anterior gray horn here. And then we also have a lateral gray horn, which is going to be this region here, kind of like the upper part of the bottom wing of the butterfly. All right, we have the white matter, which is also split up into different regions based on locations. We have the lateral white column, for example. Here's the posterior white column, right? Here we have the anterior white column. We also have the anterior white commissure. That's a connective region that connects both sides of, this is a median fissure. So this is a fissure that's basically going to be running almost all the way through, but not quite. It does not connect to the gray matter, so we still have a little bit of white matter that connects. And so that region, again, is that white commissure region. And then if we look at the commissure here for the gray matter, that's found in the interior part of the butterfly. And again, it's going to be the part that lines right up with that. This is a fissure on this side. It's a sulcus, or kind of like a precursor to a fissure that never became a fissure. Here, or just kind of like an indent, I guess, here in the posterior region. And again, that posterior sulcus is going to run all the way through to the gray commissure, or the center part of the gray matter, over to the white commissure, which is then going to lead into that anterior white, that median fissure of the white matter. All right, so as I mentioned, information is coming in and coming out. So if information is coming in here in blue, this is a nerve impulse for sensations. Ouch, I just stepped on a tack, right? That information comes in and then it gets relayed. Now, sometimes it gets relayed up to the brain. Information gets processed and comes back down where it affects, where nerves get turned on or impulses get sent to skeletal nerves to cause the muscles to fire. Other times, information gets relayed directly. So when you step on a tack, you don't think about stepping on a tack and that I should lift my foot up and now I'm going to lift my foot up. You just instantly do it. And that's because we have these specialty regions that are called interneurons. And interneurons work without communicating directly to the brain. Now, yes, information goes to the brain, but it performs an action before the brain receives and interprets that signal. So this purple thing here is called an interneuron, and it's going to connect regions where information comes in from the sensory of neurons and where information is relayed back out in terms of nerve impulses. Now you'll notice that we have two different sets of nerve impulses here. They're shown in red and in green. The red is impulse to the skeletal muscles or voluntary motion, and then the green is impulses to cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, glandular tissue, etc., or involuntary motion, right? Another thing of notice here is that these are regions where we have roots. So we start off with rootlets, and then they come together. We have one in the anterior section and in the posterior section of both the left and the right side. And then these rootlets come together to form a root, and that root comes together to form a nerve when it's combined from both the anterior and the posterior roots. So then we end up with the spinal nerves that are going to actually go out and service the regions that we talked about just previously. I believe I've touched on everything here, but anything I haven't touched on, we will be moving on. We'll be touching on again later on. All right, so this is what an actual image looks like if you were to look at a cross-section of the spinal cord. This is a transverse plane. It's taken right here around this the clavicular region. And this is what I'm talking about when I say gray matter versus white matter. There truly is a distinct color change. And then again, we have the butterfly. So if we're looking at the posterior region, the posterior region is in the back. That's going to be the lower part of the butterfly. That's the posterior gray horn. The anterior region is this anterior gray horn right here. And then we also have a lateral gray horn, which is going to be servicing the lateral region of the spinal column. And we also have, again, that white matter. That white matter is going to be divided left and right, so is obviously the gray matter. And we are dividing it by a sulcus in the back region, in the posterior region, and by an actual fissure in the anterior region. Again, the regions of connectivity, those are called the commissures, right? So here's the connected region here, white commissure, gray matter commissure. Those aren't depicted here, but that would be here and there. Then the commissure has a central region that's called the central canal in the very, very center of the spinal cord. And here it is showing the gray commissure here. I don't see the white commissure. All right, so as I previously mentioned, we have a lot of information coming in and a lot of information coming out. And so the anatomy of the spinal cord is designed to allow both sensory and motor information to be processed in a very highly organized way. So here we have sensory receptors. Let's start at 1. If we have sensory receptors in the skin that are going to send information on, tactile receptors that say, ouch, I just stepped on a tap, for example. That's going to send information via a sensory neuron. And we see we have 3 separate sensory neurons running through this same spinal root, and this would be the spinal nerve itself, and that's because the nerve itself is going to be comprised of multiple different nerves. So that giant nerve ganglion has a ton of individual nerve fibers that are going to run through it, that are each going to have their own axons and dendrites, etc. All right, so that sensory information is going to get passed in. And as I mentioned, we have a quick way of bypassing sending information up to the brain and having it come back down and then relay information back down. That's called this interneuron here. That interneuron pathway is depicted in purple. But at the same time, information is going to go up into the brain from the sensory tract. It's showing it on both sides here. Here's the sensory tract on the left and on the right. That information, again, is going to go up into the brain, and then that brain is going to process that information and send information back down through the descending tract here. That's the motor tract. So again, information comes in from the sensory tract, and it's going to get sent out through the motor tract. Once that information gets sent down, it can get sent down in 2 different ways, voluntary and involuntary muscle. So here's voluntary muscle, skeletal muscle, right? And then here's involuntary muscle. So this is something like the flight or fight response, increasing epinephrine in your body, which would then increase your heart rate but decrease your digestion, for example. So we have also of interest, so we have 2 different pathways there is what I was going to say. We have a pathway that's going to feed into the skeletal muscle, and then a pathway that's going to feed into all of the other types of muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, glandular secretions, and other types of internal information, like for your internal organs. Now you'll also see that we have a lot of what appear to be, for example, a little Y connected to a dot here. And that's when we have a synapse. A synapse is when we take one nerve, we line it up with another nerve, and we pass information from one to the other. And we do that by acetylcholine. We talked about that previously, but that's what's depicted here. So it's not always a direct link. In fact, oftentimes this information has to go through multiple different sets of nerves to be able to have an effect on the body. All right, so spinal nerves are responsible for connecting the central nervous system to sensory receptors, your muscles, your glands, etc. And so all of these different parts of the peripheral are called the peripheral nervous system. We have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. When I say pair, I mean we have one on the left and one on the right. And they're going to come out of the same vertebrae, just on the left and the right side. And we have different sets of anterior and posterior roots. So we have anterior roots that are going to come out from the front, posterior roots come out from the back, and they attach together to a spinal nerve. And that is going to be come out of a specific segment of the spinal cord. Now, just like muscle, spinal nerves are arranged in a very specific fashion, and they also have different layers of protection. So starting at the very lowest layer, that would be one nerve, which has one axon right here. As you may remember, the axons are surrounded by that myelin sheath, which is kind of like a protective barrier. For example, your electrical cord has a bright orange wrap around it. That's because we don't want to lose the electrical signal as it goes from one part to the next, so it has rubber around it that doesn't allow the electricity to transfer. And that's what the myelin sheath does. It helps protect that electrical signal. But surrounding that myelin sheath for each axon, we have an endoneurium. Now, an endoneurium is a protective layer that makes it so that the information, the electrical charge, doesn't jump from one to the next. But we'll have these arranged in bundles. So a bundle of these nerves is going to be called a fascicle, just like the muscles, and it's going to be surrounded by a protective layer called the perineurium. So one nerve surrounded by an endoneurium, multiple sets of these are going to be called a fascicle, and they're surrounded by a perineurium. Now, multiple sets of fascicles are going to be bound together into one large spinal nerve. And as you can see, we're also going to have blood vessels and some other tissue that are going to surround it. And surrounding that entire spinal nerve, we have the epineurium. So three different layers of protection. One that surrounds the individual nerve itself, that's called the endoneurium. Then we have a nerve bundle called a fascicle that's surrounded by a perineurium. And then the entire spinal nerve is surrounded by the epineurium. And in this way, we have multiple ways of protecting the electrical charge that's traveling through these individual nerves. Because again, if that electrical charge jumps from one to the other, we can end up with completely unanticipated and unintended consequences. Now, if we look here on the right, this is basically showing you what I just showed you over here. This is one fascicle, which is a whole bundle of nerves. It is surrounded by a perineurium, right? And each individual axon is going to be surrounded by an endoneurium. Again, that's going to be comprised of going to be put together into a fascicle, which is going to have a perineurium that surrounds it, and then all of them together are going to be that's going to comprise the spinal nerve, and that's going to have the epineurium that surrounds it. Again, here's a blood vessel here in the center. All right, so I apologize. Immediately after leaving the foramen, or a hole in the vertebrae that's called the intervertebral foramen, the spinal nerve is going to divide. And if we think of this like a highway, right? As soon as you take an exit from the highway, now you're going to have an immediate choice, probably a red light, at least a stop sign, and then which way do you go from there, and then another choice from there, and then another choice from there. So multiple different branches after you pass off of the exit. And those branches are known as rami, or singular would be a ramus. And they are described by where they are located. So if they are branching out and heading toward the posterior region, that's going to be a posterior ramus or a dorsal ramus. We also have an anterior ramus, which would be headed towards the anterior region. That's also called the ventral ramus. And then we have, here's the meningeal branch. It's going to branch off to the meninges. So we have different sets of branches that come off of these exits. And then they're going to communicate. It's called rami communicants. They're actually going to be kind of communicating with one another. So if you picture that you get off the exit and you turn the wrong way, well, there's probably going to be a pretty easy fix at the next light where you can turn around or go through a neighborhood or something like that. And you'll see there's a lot of crosstalk amongst these branches as well. Some of the other things of interest, although I've already pointed these out in other diagrams, this here is obviously the spinal cord. You should recognize immediately the gray butterfly, which should orient you without knowing posterior and anterior, because you know that the posterior region has the smaller or the bottom part of the butterfly, and the anterior region has both the anterior and the lateral horns, and so that should automatically orient you. Additionally, the anterior region has an actual fissure. This just has a sulcus. So even without being able to see the butterfly, this fissure here should be enough for you to know that you're looking in the anterior region. All right, so again, we have these regions that are going to be the roots. The roots come out and then split off. We have a posterior root. Here's a posterior root ganglion, where the ganglion would be multiple sets of nerves bound together. And then this here is the anterior or ventral root. Other points of interest. Here's the dura mater and the arachnoid mater right here. And then, of course, underneath that we have the subarachnoid space. That's where you're going to find that cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF. So if you've ever known anyone that's got a spinal tap or had a spinal tap done, they basically stuck a needle in and had a draw of that cerebral spinal fluid. Again, here's that epidural space, which is going to be where they are, for example, if they're giving you an epidural, they're going to be releasing, they're going to go right through your spinal column, and then they're going to inject right here, in this epidural space, where they're going to inject something that will be a nerve agent that would stop the nerves from firing or passing information on. Okay, so I mentioned previously that we have what's called these plexus, or well, a singular is called a plexus. We have a cervical plexus, we have a brachial plexus, a lumbar plexus, etc. And a plexus is a region where you've just gotten off of the highway, right? That would be the roots themselves, and you're now branching off into the neighborhoods. These are the nerves. And as I mentioned previously, within neighborhoods, there's a lot of crosstalk. So this set of nerves here from C3 is actually talking with C4 and by proxy C5, right? C3 can also talk directly to C5, and it can talk to C2, and by proxy up to C1, right? Because C2 can talk, actually not even by proxy, it can connect directly up to C1. So all of these are actually interconnected because we have to have the crosstalk amongst these nerves, right? So these are the roots. Roots are a series of nerves. These are the individual nerves that are going to be splicing off. Now, some of them are going to be ones that you recognize, and we will be going over, especially the cranial nerves. We'll be going over those individually. But here's cranial nerve 10 is the hypoglossal nerve. We also have the lesser occipital nerve, greater auricular nerve. That's going to be, both of those are going to be coming out of C2. So hypoglossal nerve is going to be connecting there with C1. It's actually a cranial nerve, so it's going to be coming down from the cranial region, but it's going to have crosstalk with C1. And then this transverse cervical is actually crosstalking both with C3 and with C2. And then this here is the ansa cervicalis. We have the inferior or the lower root, the superior or the upper root. And again, there's crosstalk. That upper root talks to 1, that lower root talks to 3, and by proxy to 4 and to 5 and to 2. The supraclavicular services exactly where you would expect. It services just around the clavicle region. And that also, it's going to branch off of C4, but it's also going to have crosstalk again with upper and lower regions. So in this way, we have a lot of crosstalk, which means that if we have damage to one of the nerves, we can still have information relayed, which is going to be very important should we have injury, because the nervous system has a very difficult time repairing itself. All right, so on this side, I'm going to walk you through how we get from the largest section, which is the roots that are coming straight out of the spinal column itself, to the trunks, which would be the next largest section, to the anterior and posterior division here, leading into the cords, and then finally into the branches, which would be the smallest regions. So a mnemonic for the way that they branch off here of the brachial plexus will be: risk takers don't cautiously behave. Risk takers, right? Roots, trunks, divisions, cords, and branches, and that's risk takers don't cautiously behave. We have the anterior trunks and the posterior, anterior division and the posterior divisions that are going to be just coming off of the trunk. All right, so as I mentioned, we have a lot of crosstalk between the nerves. So the C5 here talks to, C5 and C6 actually come together in the trunk region, then they're going to branch off a little bit later. There's going to be crosstalk between C5 and C6 with C7. And then C8, C6, and C7 are all going to come here together in this posterior cord. So again, lots of crosstalk between these different regions. As we get down into the branches, you can see the branches are going to be named by what they service. So here's the lateral pectoral, services just what you'd expect, your pectoral region. The suprascapular is going to service your scapular region towards the back, right, the back of the upper limbs. Again, this brachial plexus is going to serve all of this, of the upper limb region. So it's going to service, for example, the back is where you get your scapula, and the pecs would be in the fronts. The auxiliary is going to run down your arm. The axillary. That's going to also be the same cord that's going to branch into the radial region. Again, that's going to service the nerves that are going to run down to, say, your thumb. And this ulnar region is going to come off C8, which also is going to come from the thoracic nerve, thoracic 1. Runs through that medial cord, and then again, when it splits off, it's going to split here into this region, but also service the ulnar region, which would be your pinky region. So it's very complicated. There's a lot of crosstalk. Am I going to quiz you on the specifics of which nerve runs where? No, but do you need to be able to read these roadmaps and be able to differentiate? Well, if an impulse is going to be lost here, what is that going to affect? Or if an impulse comes in here, which of the different nerve systems or roots is going to service it up into the brain? All right, so again, this is the brachial plexus. So the information that I just showed you here is going to be followed down into which parts of the arm it's going to be servicing. Again, that's going to be servicing the upper limb. This is one of those, again, that I want you to just take a breath and read over. I am not going to actually quiz you on which is found where, although when we get to the lab section, you will have to know at least the major branches of the nerves themselves. But just kind of let this wash over you. So information is going to be coming from the cervical region. This is 5 through 8. This is the lower cervical region, so the brachial plexus. Remember, the cervical plexus would service the upper region, like the neck and the upper part of the shoulder. This is going to go into the dorsal scapular nerve, which means it's going to go down to the scapula in the back. Here's the suprascapular nerve. Again, services the scapula. We have 3 different regions that are going to service here from the superior, middle, and inferior trunk. We're all going to be servicing the clavicular region. As we travel down, we're going to have the lateral and posterior cords that are going to split off. They're going to then service the pectoral nerve. The pectoral nerve, again, is going to go into the pecs. The subscapular nerve, which is going to be the scapular region. In the back, the upper subscapular region. And then the thoracortical nerve is going to service, say, the armpit, sort of kind of inside here. The auxiliary nerve is going to run down. Axillary nerve is going to run down. And that's going to then turn into / service the radial nerve. Again, the radial nerve is going to run down and service the thumb region. And the ulnar nerve is going to run down and service the pinky region that runs all the way down your arm. The radial nerve actually splits, so we have a deep branch and a superficial branch of the radial nerve. So the deep branch would service the inside of the arm, and the superficial would service the outside of the arm. And then this is the median nerve, runs right along the center of the forearm. And then as we go down to the ulnar nerve, we also have that superficial branch and the deep branch of the ulnar nerve. And then we have the deep branch of the median nerve is going to service the inside of the hands. The ulnar nerve is also going to service the digits. So the radial nerve is going to stop here, servicing just approximately the top of the thumb, but the ulnar nerve is going to service the pinky and the other digits as well. So this is an overview of the distribution of the nerves that come out of the brachial plexus from the cervical vertebrae. Again, I'm not going to have you memorize anything here, but you might have to read something like a roadmap, and a fair question would be if there were damage to this nerve, for example, if there were damage to the ulnar nerve, where would it affect? In that case, it would affect the digits as well as the lower part of the forearm, right? As we're traveling down, we have the lumbar and the sacral plexus. So here's the lumbar plexus. We'll move on to the sacral plexus next. As you might imagine, the lumbar plexus is going to come from the lumbar region. So we have the roots and the anterior and the posterior divisions. Just like the other plexus, we're going to have a serious amount of crosstalk. So here's L1 talking directly to L2, L2 talks directly to L3, L3 to both L2 and to L4, etc. And then L5 is actually going to run down into the lumbosacral trunk. So it doesn't really have the same amount of crosstalk as the others do because it feeds into the sacrum. So that's going to be here running into that region there. But as you can see here, L1 services the iliohypogastric, so it's going to service the ilio region of the lower hip, and then the gastric region would be servicing parts of the stomach. That splits off from L1 splits into the iliohypogastric that I just mentioned, and also into the ilioinguinal, which services the inguinal canal. Following down, we get L2 and L3. L2 is going to branch off into the genitofemoral nerve, so that's going to service the genitals and the femoral region. L2 also splits and joins up with L3 to form the lateral cutaneous nerve of the upper thigh. L3 and L4 come together to service the femoral nerve. And L3 and L4 also come together to service the obturator. Now that's here. We have an obturator, and then a very small percent of the population, actually have an accessory obturator, and that's going to be the secondary nerve here. So that's an overview of the lumbar plexus, a lot more simple than some of the other plexus that we saw previously. So as I just mentioned, but showing you specifically where we service, the lumbar plexus here, L1, is going to make that iliohypogastric nerve and also the ilioinguinal nerve. L2 reaches down into the L3 turns into the genitofemoral nerve, which then turns into the cutaneous nerve of the thigh. And then this obturator nerve here actually comes up from 3 and 4 to run into the obturator region of the thigh, which obturation is one of the specialty motions, right, that is going to be allowed for the hip region. Here we also have the hip bone, right, obviously, and the sacrum, which is a fused bone in the adult and is separated into a series of vertebrae in the children. This is the coccygeal nerve, which is going to run here out of the coccyx down further down. I apologize. Come on, go backwards. We also have the femoral nerve. Again, that's going to service the femoral region right here and here. Runs down to the sciatic nerve. If you know anybody that's had a sciatica, this is going to be a region that's going to sciatica is abnormal firing of the sciatic nerve, which causes nerve pain, again, in this lower region of the lower limb. All right, here's some other nerves. So if we're looking at the posterior view, so now we're looking at the back. The posterior view is going to show us the superior and the inferior gluteal nerve. That's going to service the buttocks region. Here we have the nerve that services the so the quadratus femoris and inferior gemellus. So it's going to service this region here. Then this is the obturator nerve. It's a nerve that runs to the superior gemellus and the obturator internus. That's going to run here. We also have a posterior cutaneous nerve of the thigh, so cutaneous means skin, so it's going to run right along the top part, so instead of being very deep, it'll run superficially. And so all of these nerves are going to service the lower limbs. This is the sacral plexus. The sacral plexus is found just underneath the lumbar plexus. The sacral and the coccygeal plexus is going to be projected up to the surface. Same thing with the lumbar. These are all going to be much further internal, but just so you can see them, they're going to be projected up. So L4 and L5 are going to, again, L4 runs into the lumbosacral trunk, which then runs into here the common fibular, which is going to then be combined with the tibial into the sciatic nerve. So the sciatic nerve actually comes from L4 all the way down to S3. And so this is why any one of these can be injured and can cause pain. So sometimes having a sciatic nerve, they sometimes refer to it as phantom pain because it's one of the pains that is easily to diagnose but very difficult to treat. So here's lumbosacral trunk. Again, that's going to run down here into the sacral region, which again turns into the sciatica eventually. So again, we have a lot of crosstalk, L4 and L5, crosstalk with the S1 through 3. All of that run into the sciatic nerve, and as we get down into S2, 3, and 4, these are also going to run into some pudendal, the perforating cutaneous, and the posterior cutaneous nerve of the thigh. S4 is actually going to connect with the coccygeal plexus, which is going to be of the coccyx region. And then we have another set of nerves here, the anococcygeal nerves, which are going to run off of S4 and S5. So as you can see, we have a lot of crosstalk between the nerves. So just because they exit at this particular vertebrae doesn't mean that they're all going to the same region, right? As I mentioned, as you get off of an exit, you can have a lot of different neighborhood and side street options. All right, so that sacral plexus, again, is going to come from L1, L2, and L3 interacting with the sacrum, the sacral plexus. That's going to run, and here's the ilioinguinal nerve and the iliohypogastric nerve that come off of L1. But if we're looking at L2 and L3, all combining with the sacral region, that's going to give us the genitofemoral nerve here. The lateral cutaneous nerve of the thigh, again, that's going to be superficial skin nerve. The obturator nerve, which runs those obturator muscles here of the hip, runs down into the femoral nerve. We also have the sciatic nerve, which, as we know, is going to be comprised of the tibial nerve and the fibular nerve, right? The common fibular, the tibial nerve and the common fibular nerve come together to form that sciatic nerve, which services the entire lower limb. It's going to then branch off. Here's the tibial nerve and the common fibular nerve. So again, they come together at the sciatica and they're going to split off. Here they're going to service the fibula and the tibia, the deep fibular nerve, and then also the superficial fibular nerve, which again is just like we talked about previously when we were talking about the femoral. It's basically going to be whether it's all the way internal in the leg or in the superficial region. And that's that, again, tibial nerve here is going to service the tibia. And then if we're looking at the back, we have some additional nerves to note here. So here's the nerve to the quadrifemoris and the inferior gemellus. Again, here's the nerve to the obturator internus right there and the superior gemellus. And then this is the posterior cutaneous nerve of the thigh, servicing the back region of the thigh, and again, the skin region or the top region. And that's going to travel down to make the common fibular nerve on the fibula side and the tibial nerve on the tibia side. Just like we saw on the front, we have the deep and the superficial fibular nerve. The tibial nerve is going to be servicing the tibia. And then as we get down into the foot, we have the plantar nerve, which services the plantar region. We have the medial, which is going to service the inside, and the lateral, which is going to service the outside. All right, I know that was a lot. However, again, I'm not going to give you specific questions referring to specifics of those, but I will expect you to be able to read those maps and answer questions from them. All right, so this is showing something called a dermatome, and dermatomes are interesting because they're not equally reflected in the front and the back. Remember, we have root ganglia that are going to come from the posterior and the anterior region that are going to service different parts of the body. And this is showing the segments of skin that are supplied by the spinal nerves that are going to carry information from those sensory regions into the brain. So in the C region, we get the entire back part of the head, for example. And here we have the outer part of the upper limb. But if, for example, we were to have injury between C4 and T1, you might have feeling in the upper part of your arm, but not the inside part of your arm, because the inside part is serviced by the T or the thoracic regions, and that also services obviously the abdomen. This here is serviced by the trigeminal nerve, which is one of the cranial nerves, and the cranial nerves actually aren't going to be shown here in these plexus. That's going to be separate. What's interesting though is that for example, here's the lumbar nerves. The lumbar nerves service all of the lower limb in the front, but in the back, the sacral nerves service the glutes. The sciatica, right, runs down and also is going to service the plexus. So you might, if you ended up with an injury here, you might end up with the ability to feel the front part of your leg, but not the back. Perhaps the inability to feel your genitalia, because that's also serviced by the sacrum. Right, so these are called dermatomes. This I will expect you to know. It's pretty simple. Know which regions of the vertebrae and actually of the spinal nerves, obviously, are going to supply different regions of the body with sensory perception. All right, so let's talk about how the information is passed from through the spinal cord from a stimulus, and then how that has the effect of having a skeletal muscle firing, for example. So white matter and gray matter have two different roles. White matter conducts nerve impulses that go to and from the brain, right? So up to the brain and back. Gray matter, on the other hand, integrates incoming and outgoing information to perform reflexes or spinal reflexes, all right? So, for example, here is the white matter. The white matter has different regions that are going to supply it, that are going to be supplied by sensory tracts, which are ascending, or motor tracts, which are descending, okay? So sensory tracts are going to be having information coming in through the spinal nerves, then that's going to run up to the brain. Information is going to come down the motor tract, and that information is going to run into the nerves, right? So they're split up into different regions. In the posterior column, we have the brachial fasciculus, and then the cuneate fasciculus. On this side over here, we have the posterior spinocerebral tract and the anterior spinocerebral tract. These are going to be on the lateral region of the spinal column. These are the spinal nerves. Obviously, they start from the spinal rootlets that then run into the spinal nerves. In terms of our motor tracts, we have the lateral corticospinal tract, the rubrospinal tract, the lateral reticular spinal tract, and the vestibulospinal tract here. All of these are motor tracts, or descending information comes from the brain and is going to end up going into, here's the tectospinal tract, I almost forgot that. That's going to go into the muscles themselves, so into effectors or motor nerves, or neurons. So let's talk about reflexes. What is a reflex? A reflex happens so fast that you don't even know that you've processed it. Reflex arcs actually bypass the brain sometimes, and that means that you can have instantaneous motion if you've encountered something that's a negative stimulus, something like putting your hand on a hot stove. The amount of time that it would take for your brain to tell your nerves to move that hand would mean that you'd have more damage to your hand than if we were able to have what's called a reflex arc. Reflexes are in response to triggers that are going to help us return to homeostasis. So anytime we have a change in the environment that needs a really fast response, that's going to be predictable. For example, it's really hot, I want to move my hand. It's really sharp, I want to move my foot, right? These reflexes allow us to maintain homeostatic conditions and to help avoid or prevent further injury to regions that we've already injured. And the spinal cord is an integrating center for these spinal reflexes. And what happens in the spinal cord is we have what's called integration. And that means that sensory information comes in and motor information goes out lickety-split so quickly that we haven't even had time to send that information up to the brain and back down. So this is a way we can bypass the brain if we know for sure that what the brain is going to say, basically. The brain's going to say, get your foot off of that tack. So I'm going to bypass the brain. I'm not even going to ask, and I'm going to get your foot off of that tack. And that happens kind of like this. So here's a sensory receptor. Oh, look, they even used tack. That's fantastic. All right, so I just stepped on a tack. Ouch. So that information is going to go into these tactile receptors. You'll notice there's a whole ton of them that are going to get serviced by the same nerve. But once that nerve fires, that neuron of that nerve is going to fire, and it's going to go through the axon and send information to the integrating center. So we're going to travel through that spinal nerve, through the white matter into the gray matter. Now, the gray matter is responsible for integration. So it's integrating the information, and it knows for sure that the brain is going to say, get your foot off of that tack. So while it does send the information up into the brain, at the same time, it also basically bypasses waiting for the brain's response and tells the motor nerve to fire pretty much immediately. And that motor nerve is going to, neuron is going to fire, resulting in the effector muscle or gland, etc., responding immediately to that motor impulse through an integrating center in the central nervous system that's relaying the information without having to speak directly to the brain. And that's a reflex arc. A reflex arc is something where we have information coming in and going out so quickly that it doesn't actually have to communicate directly with the brain. And this is in some case like an emergency, or, well, not an emergency, but stepping on a tack constitutes an emergency in your homeostasis, right? You don't want your foot to be there, and so you're going to pull it off immediately. We have multiple different types of reflex arcs. This is all completely testable, by the way. Basically, if we have a reflex that occurs on the same side, it's called ipsilateral, ipsi meaning the same. If we have a reflex arc that occurs on opposing sides, that's called contralateral. And I'll talk about a good example of those in just a second. A monosynaptic means that we only have one synapse. So we have information from nerve A to nerve B, and that's it. There's not a bunch of different tracts that have to get passed through different synapses. But if we do have multiple synapses, that's called polysynaptic, many synapses. And we also have something very interesting called reciprocal innervation. Basically what that happens is we have innervation that is set up such that contraction of one set of muscles is accompanied at the exact same time as inhibition of the opposite set of muscles. What does that mean? Well, if we have one that flexes and it's going to fire, the extensor is not going to fire, right? So the opposing muscle is not going to fire. An example, we have a stretch reflex. A stretch reflex is, we skipped right over it. So a stretch reflex is going to help control the length of the muscle by causing muscle contraction. So basically you want to make sure that you don't overextend or underextend, and so you're going to allow for muscle contraction to kind of regulate itself by this stretch reflex. We also have tendon reflex, which controls your muscle tension by causing muscle relaxation. Right? So here we have, let's start with one. We have enough information coming in through this sensory receptor. That's going to come in the form of, oh, we got increased tension. Increased tension is actually, here's 5, which is the end, but we start at 5 to get to 1. So we have the muscle attached to the tendon relaxes and relieves the excess tension, right? And that happens because step 1 is that we have too much tension. So if we have too much tension, that's going to lead to a sensory neuron getting excited. That sensory neuron is going to have this interneuron space, which leads to inhibition. That inhibition is going to, feed backwards, right? That inhibition is going to feed, through the integrating center, feed backwards such that the motor neuron that is antagonistic to the muscles is excited. So the opposite muscle is going to fire, so the antagonistic muscles contract. At that same time, the effector muscle relaxes, and so then we're going to relieve the excess tension. So in this way, if we have too much tension, we can cause the opposite muscle to fire, so we can relieve that tension on the effector muscles. Right, so that's called a tendon reflex. We also have a withdrawal reflex, which is what I was just talking about with the stepping on a tack. This is basically an automatic reflex that allows you to move a limb in order to avoid injury or further pain. So that information starts coming in here from the sensory receptor. Ouch, I stepped on a tack. That information then excites a sensory neuron, which sends that information through the spinal nerve, into this gray matter, and that gets relayed through that interneuron space. Right? That interneuron space says, I already know the answer to this. I don't have to even talk to the brain. I mean, I will talk to the brain, but I'm not going to wait for a response because I know that I need you to get your foot off of that tack. And so that's going to then get sent out, by that interneuron through here. Going to the effector muscle, the flexor muscle is going to allow us to contract and withdraw the leg. That's a flexor reflex on the same foot. We also have a crossed-extensor reflex. If you picture that you stepped on a tack with your right foot and you very quickly picked your right foot up, then your left foot would have to be what you were standing on. So this crossed-extensor reflex is going to allow you to maintain balance. And this is one of those reflexes that actually diminishes with age. So an elderly person is much more likely to fall if they step on a tack than a younger person is, for example. All right, so now we have information coming in. We're stepping on a tack. Again, it's going through that sensory neuron. Same thing, it's going into that interneuron pathway. But now we're going to talk about another path. So we just previously talked about the flexor muscles withdrawing the right leg. That's the reflex of the same leg. That's what we call ipsilateral. But at the same time, we have a contralateral reflex, whereby an interneuron is going to then relay information over to the other leg, the left leg, and cause it to extend while this one is flexing. Why? Because we have to maintain balance. And so if I take all the weight off the right leg, I have to transfer it over to the left leg. And I have to do that without thinking. And so this is happening at the same time that we have this ipsilateral reflex, where we are going to step on a tack on the right foot and move that right foot. We also have a contralateral reflex, whereby we step on the right foot and put pressure on the left foot, okay? So that's a crossed-extensor reflex, and it's used to help maintain balance when you have something that's good, like an injury, like stepping on a tack. Now, we oftentimes will be able to use reflexes to diagnose nervous system disorders or locate the region of injured tissue. If we know that a particular reflex is abnormal or absent, then we know the damage is found along that conduction pathway. Right? And the damage that has resulted from different dramatic injuries is directly related to the degree of the spinal cord section and how compressed the segments involved have become. Right? So I appreciate you guys sticking it out to the end of this lecture, and I will see you guys next time for Unit 14. Thank you so very much. Aloha and happy studying.